So 2025 was apparently the year paleontologists decided to just absolutely embarrass every dinosaur out there, because these ones are going to make a T-Rex just look normal. And honestly, one of them died in the middle of eating another dinosaur, which is the most metal way to become a fossil. These are the strangest dinosaurs that we have found in 2025. So let's start with the JOANQUINRAPTOR, which is a dinosaur that died in the middle of eating lunch. And I don't mean it choked or something normal. I mean paleontologists found this thing with a crocodile leg still jammed between its teeth, which is the kind of fossil you find and go, well, that's bad timing. This happened 70 million years ago in Argentina. And honestly, the fact that we know what this dinosaur's last meal was kind of insane. Most fossils are just bones sitting in rocks, but this one decided to become a crime scene photo. The crocodile leg was just there, stuck in its jaws, which means whatever killed JOANQUINRAPTOR happened fast enough that it didn't even get to finish chewing. Now, JOANQUINRAPTOR was not small. This thing was 7 meters long, so about the length of 3 cars parked end to end. It had this long, narrow skull filled with serrated teeth that could slice through meat pretty easily. The really terrifying part was its arms, because unlike T-Rex, which had those famously useless little arms, JOANQUINRAPTOR had long functional arms with 30-centimeter claws on them. That's almost a foot long per claw, which is excessive. Scientists think it used both its bite and its claws to kill things, so it would grab prey with those hook claws and then just go to town with its teeth. It's a very hands-on approach to murder. And the crocodile leg in its mouth proves it was eating other predators, which is a power move, honestly. Most predators stick to herbivores because they're easier and less likely to fight back, but JOANQUINRAPTOR apparently decided to make things difficult for itself. It lived in these humid coastal swamps in Patagonia, and the whole area was packed with Dinosaurs and Hadrosaurs, but JOANQUINRAPTOR was likely an apex predator. Nothing was really hunting it, which makes sense because what's going to mess with something that eats crocodiles? And speaking of arms, well, this next dinosaur we found this year had the longest hands possible. So MEXIDRACON is what happens when evolution just keeps going and nobody tells it to stop. This dinosaur's hands were so long that its palm bones were literally longer than its upper arm bones, which doesn't make any sense from a structural standpoint, but here we are. We found this dinosaur. It was only about 3 meters long and weighed less than 100 kilograms, so it was pretty light. It had this small head with a beak and no teeth. It was a very ostrich-looking situation. It probably had feathers too, because that's just what these ostrich dinosaurs did. But the arms are what made scientists go, what is this thing doing with these? The name Longimanus, which is its full scientific name, literally means long hand, which is the most straightforward scientific naming I've ever seen. They just looked at it and went, well, the hands are long, so there you go, that's its name, your long hand. And nobody really knows for sure what it used them for, which makes it even better. One theory is that it could reach really high into trees to grab branches and pull them down to eat the leaves, doing its own tree service. Another idea is that it stood in shallow water and used its long arms to grab fish, which seems weird for something with a short beak, but I don't know, maybe it worked. Or maybe it just had long arms for no reason and evolution was messing around that day. It lived in coastal Mexico about 73 million years ago, right along these brackish marshes where the ocean met the rivers. They found its bones mixed in with oyster shells and other marine stuff, so it definitely spent time near the water. And this was the southern part of North America back then, which had totally different dinosaurs than the northern part. So MEXIDRACON was part of this whole separate ecosystem that did its own thing. As far as staying alive goes, it was probably pretty good at running away from stuff. These ostrich dinosaurs were fast and could just sprint away from all their problems, kind of like I do in real life. But that is nothing compared to one of T-Rex's actual family members that we found this year. So KHANKHUULUU is a dinosaur that scientists got really excited about because it's apparently the missing link in the whole T-Rex family tree, which is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but this time they actually mean it. Also, that name, KHANKHUULUU, that is such a cool name for a dinosaur. This thing lived 86 million years ago in Mongolia, and it was about 4 meters long and weighed around 750 kilograms. So way smaller than a T-Rex, which was enormous, but bigger than the earlier Tyrannosaurs that were still kind of figuring things out. It's right in the middle, which is why everyone's calling it the bridge species. The nickname for it is Dragon Prince, which is a little dramatic, but I guess when you're a missing link, you get dramatic names. It had this long, slender snout with blade-like teeth that had serrations on both edges, and its legs were long and thin, which means means it was built for running. This was not a slow, heavy tank. This was a pursuit predator that could actually chase things down. And here's the big difference. It still had long arms with 3 fingers that actually worked. If you remember your dinosaurs, T-Rex had those tiny, useless arms that couldn't even reach its mouth. But KHANKHUULUU could use its arms to grab stuff while it was killing them. It was a very useful feature that T-Rex decided to just throw away for some reason. Scientists think it hunted smaller dinosaurs, probably stuff in the 100 to 200 kilogram range. You know, things that couldn't fight back too hard. It would run them down and then use the combination of claws and teeth to finish the job. Maybe it hunted in pairs too, which would make it even more effective, but that's not been confirmed yet. It lived in these river valleys in the Gobi Desert, which back then wasn't a desert at all. It was more of a semi-arid woodland with rivers running through it. And this was in Asia, which matters because Tyrannosaurs apparently evolved there first. That is pretty normal though, unlike this plant eater with 2 fingers. DUONYCHUS is a plant-eating dinosaur that decided 3 fingers was way too many, so it just got rid of one. And I don't mean it lost one in an accident. I mean over millions of years of evolution, this thing's 3rd finger just shrank down to a useless little nub that didn't do anything. It was very committed to the 2-finger lifestyle. Now, you're probably wondering why a plant eater needed fingers at all, and the answer is because it had these absolutely massive claws that it used to pull tree branches down to its face so that it could eat leaves. Each claw was about 30 centimeters long and they were curved and sharp, which seems excessive for gardening, but that's what we had at the time. And when they found one of these fossils, the keratin sheath was still on the claw, which almost never happens. It turned out the claw was actually 40% longer in real life than just the bone part, so it had even bigger claws than we thought, which is already pretty big. This thing was about 3 meters long and weighed around 260 kilograms, so decently sized but not huge. It walked on 2 legs and had this pot-bellied body because it needed a big gut to digest all of the plants it was eating. It was a very ungraceful looking animal. If you know the Therizinosaurus, yes, it's related to that. And it lived in Mongolia about 95 million years ago in this river floodplain that apparently had 4 different species of these weird plant-eating theropods all living together, which means they had to split up the food somehow so they weren't all fighting over the same bushes. The claws weren't just for eating though, they were also for defense. If something tried to eat the DUONYCHUS, it could swing those 30-centimeter hooks at them and probably do some damage. Not enough to win a fight against a real predator, but enough to make them reconsider their choices. Now, this one at least had a defense plan, unlike the next guy we're going to talk about. ENIGMACURSOR, yes, these names are just metal. I love what we're doing with dinosaurs these days. Anyways, ENIGMACURSOR was about the size of a turkey. You get a badass name, but you're a turkey. And its entire survival strategy was just running away from things. That's it. That's the whole adaptation. It had really long legs and could sprint fast, and that's what kept it alive in an ecosystem where everything else was trying to eat it. This thing was only 1 meter long and so tiny, and it lived 152 billion years ago in the Morrison Formation, which was in Western North America back then. And the Morrison Formation is famous for having every giant dinosaur you've ever heard of. Diplodocus was there, Stegosaurus was there, Allosaurus was definitely there trying to eat everything. So ENIGMACURSOR was just this little plant eater running around hoping nobody noticed it. The name means mysterious runner, which is generous because there's nothing mysterious about why it could run fast. It needed to run fast or it would die pretty much immediately. The fossil they found was actually a juvenile too, so it was still growing and probably even more scared than an adult would be. It was just a baby dinosaur with anxiety problems trying to make it in a world full of things with teeth. It lived in these floodplains and riverbanks that were warm and humid with tons of plant life everywhere, so at least there was stuff to eat and places to hide. It would browse on low-growing ferns and probably stayed in groups with other small plant eaters, so there were more eyes watching for predators. It was a safety in numbers situation, even though numbers don't help that much when an Allosaurus shows up. Scientists also think it was bipedal, so it ran on 2 legs, which makes you faster, also means you're very visible when you're moving. There was no blending into the scenery for it, just full commitment to the sprinting lifestyle. It worked out well enough though that we found a fossil of it, so it lived long enough to die of something other than being eaten. But meanwhile in Egypt, scientists spent a century being completely wrong about this creature. The TAMERYRAPTOR is what happens when you find a fossil, identify it wrong, and then just leave it in a museum for 100 years before someone looks at it again and goes, wait, What is this thing actually? Well, they found these bones in Egypt back in the early 1900s, and everyone just assumed it was a known species and put it in storage. It sat there until recently when paleontologists started going through old collections and realized this was a completely new type of dinosaur that nobody had ever seen before. It just had been sitting there the whole time, misidentified. It turns out it was almost 10 meters long. It was huge, and it had these prominent horns on its nose that should have been a clue that it wasn't what they thought it was. Teeth were weird too, because they were blade-like and serrated but symmetrical, which most other predators don't have. Most predators have teeth that are offset so they can slice better in one direction, but Tameryraptor's teeth could cut equally well on the push and the pull. It was a very efficient butchery setup. It lived in the Bahari Oasis in Egypt about 95 million years ago, which back then was this steamy mangrove swamp situation on the edge of an ancient sea. And the crazy thing is this place was packed with apex predators. Dinosaurs was there, other huge carnivores were there, and Tameryraptor was just another giant predator competing for food, which raises the question of how they all coexisted without starving, and the answer is probably that they all ate different things or hunted in different ways. The nose horn might have been for display or for fighting other Tameryraptor individuals over territory, or maybe it was for attracting mates, which seems impractical, but evolution does weird things sometimes. Either way, it definitely wasn't being used to identify the fossil correctly, but at least they found bones, not just a sail. Picture a dinosaur that's about as big as a bison, and then somebody just glued a giant fin to its back for no good reason. Well, that's ISTIORACHIS, and the sail running down its spine was taller than any other plant eater in Europe at the time, which is saying something because Europe had plenty of weird dinosaurs, and plenty of weird animals there still. They found this thing on the Isle of Wight in England, which is apparently where all the British dinosaurs decided to die because that place is just packed with fossils. Beans on toast, crumpets, wee. This was 125 million years ago when England was actually warm and subtropical instead of the cold and depressing wasteland that it is today. So at least the dinosaurs had nice weather. ISTIORACHIS lived in these marshy floodplains with early ankylosaurs and some pretty big predators that absolutely would have tried to eat it, just like a British man tries to eat his beans on toast. The sail was made of these extremely tall vertebrae that stuck up way higher than they needed for any structural reason. And scientists looked at it and went, well, it's not for temperature control because the climate was already warm. So it's probably just for looking cool, which is a real thing in evolution. Animals develop features purely for showing off to other animals. Peacock tails, deer antlers, dinosaur sails, all for the looks. I mean, look at humans. We do the craziest stuff to fall in love and reproduce. Like, you've probably done something in your life for someone that you were interested in. You're like, holy shit, why the hell did I do that? I know I have. But anyways, the theory is that ISTIORACHIS traveled in herds, and when you have a whole group of these sailback dinosaurs walking around together, they look way more intimidating than they actually are. A predator sees a herd of them and has to decide if it's worth messing with all of those sails, and maybe it just moves on to something easier to kill. It weighed about 1,000 kilograms and could walk on all fours or rear up on two legs if it needed to reach higher plants or run away from something. The sail probably made it easier for herd members to spot each other from far away too, which is useful when you're trying not to get separated and eaten. Now, that sail was big, but this next neck was ridiculous. TONGNALONG, yes, that's its name, was somewhere between 23 and 28 meters long, which is absurd. And most of that length was just its neck. This thing's neck might have been over half its entire body length, which creates all kinds of structural problems that evolution doesn't give a shit about. Here's a little fun fact: there weren't any chiropractors back in the prehistoric time, so I don't know what these dinosaurs were doing. They found this fossil in China in this formation that's late Jurassic, around 147 million years ago. And when paleontologists started putting the bones together, they realized this was one of the biggest dinosaurs from that time period. Not the biggest ever, but definitely up there. And it was a Mammatusaurid, which is a family of sauropods that specifically went all in on having necks that were way too long for practical use. The weird part is that finding something this massive in China challenged the whole idea that Asia was isolated back then. Scientists used to think Asian dinosaurs were doing their own thing separately from the rest of the world, but TONGNALONG having relatives in other places means there must have been land connections letting these giants spread around, which makes sense because dinosaurs can't really swim across oceans. So if they're on multiple continents, they had to walk there. Living with a neck that long means you can eat leaves from treetops without moving much, which saves energy. You just stand in one spot and move your neck around like you're vacuuming the trees clean. It's very efficient if you ignore the fact that your heart has to pump blood up 15 meters to reach your brain. The bones were hollow and filled with air sacs to make them lighter, because if they were solid bone, this thing would collapse under its own weight immediately. It probably traveled in in small groups and ate constantly because running a body that size takes an enormous amount of food. We're talking hundreds of kilograms of plants per day just not to starve. So yeah, big necks are one problem, but bent skeletons are way worse. ASTIGMASAURA genuflexa had a skeleton that looked wrong. The tail vertebrae were bent and asymmetric, which is not how spines are supposed to work. The name genuflexa literally means bent knee, because whoever named it looked at those bones and went, yeah, that's not right, so we're gonna make fun of you and that's gonna be your name. It was 18 meters long and lived in Patagonia about 95 million years ago, and when they found the fossil, the tail bones were just arranged weird. The neural spines, which are the parts that stick up from your vertebrae, were super tall and arranged in this cross-shaped pattern that gave it a hump above its hips. And then the chevron bones underneath the tail were lopsided. They were just hanging off to one side for no reason anyone can figure out. The thigh bones were weird too because the bottom part angled inward more than normal, which means it stood with its legs slightly bent all of the time. That's very uncomfortable looking posture. Scientists think maybe this whole bent skeleton thing was because ASTIGMASAURA spent a lot of time rearing up on its back legs to reach tall trees, and all these weird bone shapes were reinforcements to handle that stress. But that's really just a guess. It might have just been built wrong. As a sauropod, it ate plants and walked on 4 legs and weighed probably 10 tons or more. It was a rebachesaurid, which is a family of sauropods that was already dying out at this point. Most of them went extinct around 90 million years ago, so ASTIGMASAURA was one of the last ones hanging on in South America before the whole group disappeared. The environment was semi-arid with rivers cutting through it and open conifer forests, and there were huge predators around, including some of the biggest carnivorous dinosaurs ever found. So being big will help you survive. Well, unless you're small and have a sail. Let's talk about TALETA. TALETA was a duck-billed dinosaur that was only about 5 meters long, which for a hadrosaur is pretty damn small, and somehow it also had a sail on its back, even though it was already having a hard enough time staying alive. This was in Morocco right at the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago, so literally right before the asteroid hit and everything died. They only found 2 jaw bones, which means most of this dinosaur is still missing, and we're just guessing about the sail part based on hints in the bones they did find. The name TALETA means 3, which is reference to it being the 3rd hadrosaur discovered in Africa, and also maybe something about a triangular sail situation that we're not totally sure about yet. Science is just making educated guesses sometimes and hoping more bones show up later. What we do know is that it lived on these coastal plains near the ocean where the climate was subtropical and humid, and there were at least 2 other species of hadrosaurs living in the same area, which means they had to split up the available plants somehow so they weren't all competing for the same food. Maybe TALETA ate different plants or lived slightly inland while the others stayed closer to the water. There must have been some kind of arrangement that let the 3 species of duckbills exist without starving. Problem with being a small hadrosaur in Africa at this time is that the predators were not small. There were abelisaurs around, which were these stocky carnivores with huge heads and tiny arms, and they would definitely eat a 5-meter long plant eater if they got the chance. Plus crocodiles in the rivers, plus probably other stuff we haven't found fossils of yet. It was a very dangerous place to be something that only eats plants and can't really fight back. Let's now talk about a dinosaur that was truly ancient. What do I mean by that? Well, HUASHANOSAURUS is about 39 feet long, which is already big, but the interesting part is how old it is. This thing is from the early to middle Jurassic, around 180 million years ago, and it's one of the oldest giant long-necked dinosaurs found in China, which matters because it pushes back the timeline of when these huge sauropods showed up in Asia by about 30 million years earlier than we thought. Finding this dinosaur literally rewrote almost everything we thought about this time period. The bones here are weird too. The forearm has this ulna bone with a hook-like process on top that other sauropods don't have, and the top part of the bone is crescent-shaped instead of round, and then the fibula, which is in the lower leg, has grooves carved into it that suggest there were some serious muscles attaching there. All these strange bone shapes were probably reinforcements to help it carry around its massive weight without its legs just snapping. It lived in this forested area near rivers and lakes that's what's now Guangxi in southern China, and they found fish scales and other aquatic animal remains in the same rock layers. So it was hanging out near water a lot, probably drinking and eating the plants that grew along the banks. The environment was humid and lush with conifers and ginkgo trees everywhere, which is perfect if you need to eat several tons of leaves per day. As far as predators go, there probably weren't many that could take down a full-grown HUASHANOSAURUS just because of how big it was. Maybe some early megalosaurid theropods if they hunted in groups, but we haven't found any predator fossils from the same formation yet. The babies would have been vulnerable though, and there were definitely crocodile-type reptiles near the water that would eat a young sauropod if they could catch one. Old and big is pretty impressive for a dinosaur, but old and tiny is even weirder. AHVAYTUM is the oldest dinosaur ever found in North America, which seems like something we should have discovered before 2025, but here we are. It lived 230 million years ago in Wyoming, back when Wyoming was at the equator and part of the supercontinent Pangea instead of being cold and full of tourists looking at geysers. This dinosaur is about 3 feet long, so roughly the size of a big chicken, and it had 5 fingers on each hand and a long tail. It was a very early primitive body plan before dinosaurs really figured out what they were doing. It was probably an omnivore, eating insects and small animals and whatever plants it could find, just doing its best to survive in the late Triassic when dinosaurs were still new and not the dominant animals yet. The discovery closed this huge gap in the North American fossil record, because before they found AHVAYTUM, there was this 6 to 10 million year period where we just had no dinosaur fossils at all from this continent. And scientists were wondering if dinosaurs even lived here during that time or if they showed up later. Turns out they were here, we just hadn't found the bones yet. The environment back then was hot and had seasonal monsoons because this was during something called the Carnian pluvial episode, which is when a bunch of rain suddenly started falling in areas that used to be deserts. So AHVAYTUM was running around these river deltas and fern glades that had just bloomed into existence, and there were early crocodile relatives and mammal-like reptiles everywhere trying to eat it. Its survival strategy was probably just hiding a lot and maybe traveling in small groups, so there were more eyes watching for danger. Being small and fast helps when everything else wants to kill you. Speaking of surviving when you shouldn't, well, this next one did that too. MELERIRAPTOR was a herasaurid, which is a type of early predatory dinosaur which normally died out pretty early in dinosaur history. Except MELERIRAPTOR didn't get the memo and just kept existing in India for way longer than it was supposed to, which is either impressive or stubborn depending on how you want to look at it. This was 220 million years ago in the early Anorian stage of the Triassic, and by this point, herasaurids had basically disappeared everywhere else on the planet. They were done, gone, extinct, dead, finito. But in central India, they were still hanging around eating things and doing fine apparently. It was about 3 to 4 meters long, so mid-sized, and had the classic herasaur build with sharp teeth and strong legs and hands that could actually grab onto prey while it bit them. The really interesting thing is that they found multiple specimens in the same area, which suggests either they were social and hunted in groups, or they all just happened to die in the same place separately. The group hunting theory is more exciting because most early predators didn't do that. They were solitary and only ran into each other when they were fighting over food or mates. But if MELERIRAPTOR was hunting in packs, that would give it a huge advantage over other predators that were working alone. The reason it survived when other herasaurids is probably because there had just been a major extinction event that wiped out a bunch of its competitors. Things like Rhinoceros, which were these big plant eaters, just vanished, and that opened up space for MELERIRAPTOR to keep doing its thing without as much competition. The climate in India was also warm and monsoonal, which maybe suited herasaurids better than the conditions in other places where they'd already gone extinct. That was adaptive at least. This one is just a very standard dinosaur. VITOSAURA is an abelosaurid from Argentina, and if you know anything about abelisaurids, you already know exactly what this dinosaur looked like because they all basically had the same body plan. Short, tall snout, check. Heavily textured, knobby skull, check. Arms so small they might as well not exist, check. It's the factory default settings for South American predators. This one is about 5 meters long, so medium sized, and they found it in northwest Argentina in a formation that hadn't had any abelisaurids discovered in it yet. So it's the first one from that specific area, which is notable for science reasons but doesn't make the actual dinosaur any more interesting. It had all the standard abelisaur features, including a skull that was built to absorb shock so it could headbutt prey or wrestle them down with its jaws since the arms were completely useless. The bones were surprisingly light and full of air spaces, which is weird for something that looks so bulky and robust. It made it lighter than you would expect, which maybe helped it move faster or just meant it didn't sink into mud as easily. It's hard to say. It lived around 80 million years ago in these semi-arid floodplains that had wet and dry seasons, and there were titanosaurs and smaller plant eaters around for it to hunt. As the top predator in its area, it didn't really have any enemies except maybe other VITOSAURA individuals fighting over territory. territory. The tiny arms meant it had to do all of its killing with its mouth. There was no grappling or slashing with claws. It was just pure bite force and neck strength. They only found parts of the spine and hips, so most of the skeleton is still missing somewhere in Argentina. But what they did find was enough to confirm it was definitely an abelsaurid and definitely very typical of that family. Typical dinosaurs are boring. Almost, but not so quite dinosaurs are way more interesting. QIANJIANGSAURUS was so close to being a hadrosaur, and it just barely didn't make it. It had the body of a duck-billed dinosaur, the size of a duck-billed dinosaur, the lifestyle of a duck-billed dinosaur, but technically it falls just outside the actual hadrosaur family tree, which must be frustrating for a dinosaur that did all of the work but doesn't get any of the credit. It was around 8 meters long and lived in southern China, around 72 to 66 million years ago, right around the end of the Cretaceous, and it had this broad upturned beak combined with batteries of grinding teeth that it used to chew up tough plants, which is exactly what hadrosaurs did. The jaw was robust and powerful. It was perfect for processing fibrous vegetation all day long, but some of the technical details of how its jaw joints worked and how its teeth were arranged were just slightly different enough that paleontologists had to classify it as a hadrosaurid instead of a true hadrosaur. The region it lived in was warm and low-lying with coastal plains and lakes and conifer forests. It was probably the main large plant eater in that area. It likely traveled in herds and migrated seasonally following food sources, and maybe made calls or used body language to communicate since it didn't have the fancy head crests that some other hadrosaurs used for making loud noises. What's interesting is that southern China apparently had these holdout populations of almost hadrosaurs living there, while true hadrosaurs were thriving everywhere else. This was some kind of geographic isolation that let these more primitive relatives stick around without being outcompeted. And they made it all the way to the end too, surviving right up until the asteroid hit and everything died, regardless of what family classification they had. And those are just some of the weirdest dinosaurs that we found in 2025. This was a new video idea for me, so let me know if you enjoyed watching it, as I really enjoyed making it. And there's tons of other dinosaurs we found this year that you definitely haven't heard about because we just found them. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to give it a like and comment down below which dinosaur was your favorite to hear about, and comment other dinosaurs that were found this year that you'd like me to talk about. If you don't want to miss any of our future uploads, make sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the hype button to make sure this video gets seen by more people. And if you want to watch another one of my videos, you can click the video on screen now.